Go.
All right, class, welcome. I want to shoot you a quick video this week because I've noticed that this week's homework can be a little bit confusing if you just have the book to go by. So what I'm going to do is use a couple of examples, well, probably just this one example from the book, break it down for you so you can really see exactly what's expected of you, and hopefully that makes your life a little bit easier. So I'm shooting a video today with my assistant Emily and my other assistant Bennett, who are here to answer some questions that I'm going to ask. This is our third shot at the video, so they already know some of the answers at the beginning, but hopefully they're going to help me work through this and see where I can really give you some assistance. So if we're looking at something like this, you can see that it's pretty confusing sounding, right? No limericks are masterpieces, hence some limericks are not poems because some poems are not masterpieces. I can see why you would look at that and say, what the heck are they going for here? My goal is to help you understand exactly what we're going for. So I pulled this from page 230 of your book. On page 230, there's an exercise about putting syllogisms, categorical syllogisms, in the standard form. It's a really nice exercise, and one thing to point out is there are little stars in your book next to some of the numbers. That means the answer is actually in the back of the book. So this is a way that you can kind of practice by yourself, see if you're getting it before you actually turn in that homework assignment. Now this isn't quite what I'm asking you to do in the actual homework assignment. It's a little bit different, but there's only one thing that you're really going to have to pay attention. If you get this concept and you get this concept, you're going to do great on the homework. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is in the book it's kind of asking you if it's in standard form. Here I'm asking you to put it into standard form. What's standard form? Standard form just means that you have two premises and a conclusion in the proper order. So how do we figure out what the proper order is? And the number one mistake that people make when they do this homework is they don't get the conclusion separated out first. So the first thing we have to do upon looking at this is figure out which one of these statements is the conclusion. How do we figure out the conclusion? Well, there's this handy thing that you remember from week one called a premise indicator and a conclusion indicator. So you can look in the week one lecture for a list of those things. You can also turn to page 72 of your book. Page 72 has a nice little list. Words like because, since, after all, in light of the fact that, these are all premise indicators. They tell you that what comes next is one of these two premises. Therefore is the main conclusion indicator that you're going to see, but there's other conclusion indicators, words like thus, so, consequently. Anything that's a synonym for therefore is going to be a conclusion indicator. Hence is another important conclusion indicator if we check out the board. So here we are. We have our thing. Our first step is to figure out what the conclusion is. Does anybody see any premise or conclusion indicators in this?
Hence.
Because. Hence and because. Thanks, guys. So we have the word hence and we have the word because. All right, I'm going to take a break here and then start a new video so I can keep these a little bit shorter in case anybody rings the doorbell or anything. So I'll be right back. Just click on the next video and we're going to continue.
Rolling.
Okay, we're back. We just identified premise indicator, which is the word because, and a conclusion indicator, which is the word hence. We're going to start with our conclusion. We know that what comes after the word hence is our conclusion. So some limericks are not poems. There's our conclusion. Our next step is to figure out which premise is premise 1 and which premise is premise 2. It's not necessarily the order that they show up in here. We have to figure out which one goes where. And it's really easy to do that. All you have to do is look at the predicate of the conclusion. And the predicate of the conclusion is just the second part of the conclusion. What comes after the word are? This is the predicate. This is called the subject. You look at the predicate of the conclusion and you see which premise that shows up in. So our predicate is poems. We look up here, no limericks are masterpieces. That doesn't have poems. This is our conclusion. And then some poems are not masterpieces. Because poems shows up in this premise, we know that that's going to be premise 1. Because it's from the predicate of our conclusion. So some poems are not masterpieces. That leaves the other premise is going to be our premise 2, but if you don't want to just go by that, you can remember that the subject of the conclusion is always going to be what falls in premise 2. So we have limericks, no limericks are masterpieces. Okay, so we're in great shape. Here we are. Some poems are not masterpieces, premise 1. No limericks are masterpieces, premise 2. And our conclusion, some limericks are not poems. Now our question is this a valid argument? And what validity means is, do true premises, if these premises are true, do they guarantee that this conclusion is true? Now, obviously, we're not going to worry about whether these premises are true or not. They're almost nonsense, right? We can't really know the truth of this. But what is important here is the form. Is this in a form that if these premises were both true, they would guarantee that conclusion? And for categorical syllogisms, the form is always, there's a certain set of forms that are always valid, and there's a certain set of forms that are always invalid. So really, we just got to pull this apart and figure out, is this a valid form or not? So we remember from this week's lesson, we had the A, E, I, and O statements, right? Some poems are not masterpieces, you'll remember, is of the form O. No limericks are masterpieces, you'll remember is E. And some limericks are not poems, you'll again remember is O. Now my class is looking at me like, I don't remember that stuff, right? But that's okay. My class, you guys definitely remember that from this week. So what that means is we have an OEO.
All right.
Okay, so we had a cut there. We're back. So what our next step is to figure out where the middle term is, what position it's in. And that's what's going to be called the figure of this categorical syllogism. So we know it's OEO because this is an O, that's an E, that's an O. But the next question is, where does the middle term fall? So our minor term, our major term, and our middle term are the three parts here. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. It shows up in premise 1. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. It shows up in premise 2. And the middle term doesn't show up in the conclusion at all, but it shows up in both of these. So we know limericks shows up here and here. We know poems shows up here and here. And then you'll see that masterpieces shows up in both premises. So that means that masterpieces is our middle term. Now masterpieces could show up in the predicate in both of the premises. It could show up in the subject in both of the premises, or it could show up in the subject here and the predicate here, or the subject here and the subject here and the predicate here. So where the middle term shows up is going to tell you what figure that your categorical syllogism is in. In this case, you'll see that masterpieces shows up in the predicate of both premises. And you don't have to memorize this stuff. It's all right on page 228 of your book. When the middle term shows up in the predicate of both premises, that puts us squarely in the second figure. And that's our goal, to figure out OEO2 tells us whether this is a valid form or an invalid form. And of course, in the second figure, right at the bottom on page 228, it tells you that in the second figure, OEO does not show up as a valid form, so this is not a valid argument. So, email me with your questions. I know that can be a little bit confusing. Start with your book, go through some of those exercises, check your answers in the back of the book on page 230, go through some of those exercises. Review this video, go through the lecture, and then if you still have questions, definitely send me an email, and hopefully I'll be able to answer those questions as well. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's video.
Scruffy.